So welcome everyone. My name is Ruby Ziegler. I chair in Europeans UK, and this is a meeting about voting rights, both more generally of migrants in the UK, and then specifically in light of the local elections of certain groups of vulnerable EU citizens and the challenges that they face. So we're going to take those in turn, and then we're going to have the speakers speak initially, and then open it up for a wider discussion. So our first speakers, as you were, would be Councillor Lara Parizotto, who is the co-director of the Migrant Democracy Project, and she'll talk about the campaign to give all long-term residents, those with either settled status or indefinite leave to remain, the right to vote in general elections. And Denisa Strango, her colleague, will talk about the work to get out the vote in relation to EU citizens and long-term residents ahead of the local government election. So the floor is yours, and we'll after you we'll take Luljeta.
Yeah, I think so. Hello. So a lot of what I'll be saying is on our on our briefing paper here, and for those online, mainly Jane, you can find it on our website. So yeah, my name is Lara. I'm the co-director of Migrant Democracy Project, and this organization started really as a result of the elections bill, but also generally a lot of work in getting migrants to understand their political standing in the UK and become the political force that we can be, that we are. Last census showed that 1 in 6 residents in England and Wales were born outside of the UK. So in many ways, we are a significant enough number, and in some places, some constituencies, we could even shift election results. But that's not necessarily why we do the work. But in any way, we want to inform migrants across the UK that this is their home, and so their democratic participation, their rights also apply. That's why our campaign is called Our Home, Our Vote. So at first, we started with that work of just informing EU citizens, particularly about their rights to vote in local elections in the UK. And then, fortunately or unfortunately, with the elections bill that came, there was that trigger moment of saying EU citizens that arrive in the UK from the 1st of January 2021 will no longer have the automatic right to vote in local elections unless they come from a country that has signed a bilateral voting rights agreement with the UK. And at the moment, the 4 countries that have signed these bilateral voting rights agreements are Poland, Luxembourg, Spain, and Portugal.
Now, could you hold for just 2 seconds? I need to admit someone on Zoom.
Oh, I can do that.
Yeah, you can get tomorrow. I think might be
No, I don't know.
I thought it, yeah.
So those citizens of those 4 countries have the right to vote in local elections.
Yeah.
You just got a question from Peter here, so can you repeat it?
Well, put it that way, when were those agreements made with the 4 countries?
So the more comprehensive detail is that EU citizens that arrived in the UK by the 31st of December 2020, pre-Brexit, EU citizens will continue having the right to vote in local elections as they do now. The EU citizens that arrived in the UK from the 1st of January 2021, let's call them post-Brexit, will only be able to vote in local elections if their country of origin has secured a bilateral voting rights agreement with the UK. At the moment, the only 4 countries, as I said, are Poland, Luxembourg, Portugal, and Spain. Where
we've got Cyprus and Malta.
Cyprus and Malta as Commonwealth.
Commonwealth.
Yeah. Where this is going to become, it is already complicated, but it's about to become more complicated, is that this has changed in the law. It's an act now, Elections Act, but has not changed in practice. So in May 2024, in the local elections, including mayoral elections, every EU citizen will be able to register and vote. However, from June onwards, many local authorities, or every local authority across the country, will have to do the job of removing some EU citizens from the electoral roll, specifically those who entered the UK in 2021, 2022, 2023, or this year, and have already registered to vote, have voted, but from June onwards will not be able to vote. So I'm a councillor, but I'm not necessarily here as a councillor. But I do know that my democratic services team is very tiny, very small, and I do not believe that they want to be spending the resources on removing EU citizens from the electoral roll. Our conversations with civil servants have told us that this exercise of mass removal of people from the electoral roll has not been done before. Yes, people are removed from the electoral roll on a daily basis if they move, but not on a mass scale, which will put a lot of pressure on local authorities who will have to identify if an EU citizen arrived in the UK before 2020 or before 2021 or after 2021, and if their country of origin has a bilateral voting rights agreement. And it also poses the complication, which Denisa will talk more later, of us as campaigners or yourself as a politician going out, doing canvassing. And from now on, you're going to have to do that work of where are you from? What date did you arrive in the UK? Does your country have a bilateral voting rights agreement with the UK? And then what happens when Romania signs a bilateral voting rights agreement with the UK? Then all of those who are removed from the roll will have to be added to the roll. What about when potentially Portugal withdraws from the bilateral voting rights agreement? Again, another mass exercise. So overall, we believe that this system is very complex. It's not fair to be removing people from the electoral roll. And it's just not really simple. So we are proposing a case for residence-based voting rights. And we are proposing at 2 levels. We propose residence-based voting rights in local elections. So we already have groups of migrants voting in local elections in the UK. So we have, at the moment, every EU citizen with the right to vote in local elections, as well as Commonwealth and Irish migrants who can also then vote in general elections. So we would like to see that right to vote being extended in local elections to every lawful resident, and that would extend the right to vote to at least over 1 million people. So I'm talking about people from Albania who may not yet have a dual citizenship, or people from Ukraine, people from the US, a lot of people from South America, where I'm from, that don't yet have a British citizenship. But also, we don't believe that it's fair that so many long-term residents are not being able to vote in general elections. I think for many of us in here, a really important case was the Brexit referendum, where we were locked out of the vote, even though it was so deeply affecting our lives in the UK. And again, there is the case already that some migrants do vote in general elections, Commonwealth citizens, no matter how long they've lived in the UK. Yeah. So why can't EU citizens, why can't any resident from any nationality who has at the very least secured indefinite leave to remain or settled status, which will most likely mean at least 5 years of residence in the UK?
And some, you may want to add, some countries don't allow dual citizenship, and yeah, to be very, very expensive. I mean, it's only quite $2,000.
Correct. Yes. So people may ask, is this possible? Yes, it is. Scotland and Wales have already extended the franchise in local elections because those are the elections that they actually can control due to devolution. But there are countries outside of the UK who have also extended the right to vote based on residence, the famous case being New Zealand. And yes, the point then, people may say, why can't they just become British? And Elsie, you've just covered it. Unfortunately, becoming British is not an option available to everyone. I have become a British citizen, and I'm very fortunate and grateful that I now can vote in general elections. But a lot of people cannot. Some people cannot because they cannot afford. And some people cannot because their country of origin does not allow dual nationality. And we're talking about, we live in a mobile society, and people are not prepared to give up on their original citizenship if they still may have to, for example, care for parents, family members at home. So essentially, this is what we're proposing. We're proposing a case for residence-based voting rights, where in local elections, at least every lawful resident can register to vote, and in general elections, where every settled resident can vote. And we believe that this will make fairer and more simpler system, which would make our lives all a bit easier in explaining who can vote and why the vote matters. And I was going to pass it to my colleague Denisa, who will say a bit of how we've been doing this work of promoting voter registration.
With our Home Our Vote campaign and our just migrant democracy projects work, we tend to want to spread awareness about voter rights, specifically to communities. So we tend to go to the local community centers, food banks perhaps specific to the community, as well as community events. So for example, we've been to several events catered to EU member states. For example, we've been to Romanian, we've been to Polish events, but we've also been to Brazilian events. We've also been to Turkish, Armenian events. And in all of those events and community festivals, we have registered more than 10 people per festival, which is really important. We have a tangible impact on these people, and we get to see their concerns. We get to answer some of the issues that they have and get to signpost them to several resources and several organizations that may help them. But we also see that the main issue that they have is not being able to actively participate in the democratic process, and that is a real concern for them. So we try to go to local stakeholders, which a lot of local communities have trust in, and try to raise awareness of the importance of being registered to vote if you're able to vote in the UK, and also just try to foster this active participation in democracy that we want to achieve. And by going to these local community events and just community festivals, we want to create.
Just a second, we've got a guest.
Sorry.
That's okay. Jeanette,
Yes, it's Julie.
yes. Yeah.
Julie, Baroness Mrs. Newham, we've got Luljeta here from the Shpresa program. Shpresa program, I'm going to do this, which means talking. This is lovely. And Lara, the councillor from the Migrant Democracy. Oh, you know each other. And her colleague, oh, no, sorry about this. Can you take over? Sorry.
And Denisa Strango, so we're just now discussing voting rights. Firstly, Lara was presenting the case for a residence-based voting rights in local elections and long-term residence-based for general elections. And now we're talking about the get out and vote around the local elections, particularly.
Yeah, so as I was saying, when we go to these community events, we have resources, for example, leaflets in the specific language. If you go to a Romanian festival, we try to have leaflets and resources in English, but as well as in Romanian, because we know that a lot of people do not speak English and they may find it hard to understand our information, or we tend to have a speaker from the community that speaks and can actively interact with the person on a more deeper level. And we also try to understand what barriers these residents and individuals have to register to vote in the UK. A lot of these barriers include misinformation, as well as a lack of information. A lot of people, even Commonwealth citizens, are not aware that they have the right to vote in the UK. And it's a real concern. But also EU citizens, for example, myself, I didn't know that I couldn't vote. I knew I could vote in elections, but I didn't know which. I didn't know that there was a difference. I could vote in Mayor of London elections and local elections, but not in general elections. And it's a real difference. And we just want to make sure we go out there and address these concerns and inform people and spread awareness directly, and make sure that they know of their rights.
I ought to know the answer to this, but the fact that I don't know the answer is probably quite significant. What are the rights now of EU nationals who don't have settled status? Have we kept open the right to vote in local elections?
We've discussed.
Yeah, I can cover really quickly for our new friends. That's okay. I'll just wait for you to sit down.
This is Brenda King.
Hi, Brenda.
She heads up an organization as a CEO, which helps people from Caribbean background.
Amazing.
With education materials.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah, now in person after the AGM.
Cool. So
so
just briefly again on who can vote, and you can find that information on the leaflet. But every EU citizen at the moment can register to vote and vote. So for the May 2024 local elections, when you go out, for the simplicity of people understanding their rights, just tell them they can register and they can vote. How in local elections, yes. From June onwards,
Unless it's general election.
Unless it's a
subject.
general election at the same time.
but then the EU citizens will not be able to vote in those. But from June onwards, unfortunately, because of the Elections Act, there will be the removal of some EU citizens from the electoral register. So briefly, EU citizens that arrived in the UK by the 31st of December 2020 will continue being able to vote, whether they have settled or pre-settled status. EU citizens that arrive in the UK from the 1st of January 2021 will only be able to vote in local elections if their country of origin has secured a bilateral voting rights agreement with the UK. And at the moment, the only 4 countries that have secured these agreements are Poland, Luxembourg, Spain, and Portugal. So your job, our job collectively will become a bit more difficult when you're out on the doorstep, because you're not only going to have to ask where the person is from, you're also going to have to ask when they arrived in the UK and if they have a bilateral voting rights agreement with the UK. So we believe that, as Denisa was saying, like there is generally this lack of information. It's difficult to get even Commonwealth citizens to have full voting rights, to tell them that they have the right to vote. And our view as an organization is that we're making it more difficult to explain voting rights. We would wish that it was a simpler system of saying, if you live here, you have the right to vote. If you have the lawful residence, you have the right to vote at the very least in local elections. When I was a student at uni, I could vote because I had an EU citizenship, but many of my other friends couldn't vote. And I now have friends from Brazil that have lived in the UK for 17, 20 years and have never been able to vote, not even in a local election. So that's what we want to change.
Exactly, and I mean, I think the interesting, so Lord Brennan was unable to hear, actually asked a question to the Minister and also Lords on this deregistration, right?
Yeah.
The removal of people from the ballot, and one of the answers about why you would keep the Commonwealth citizens' right to vote is that having deep historic links to the Commonwealth. Now, I've done a bit of my own research and discovered there are 3 countries that have actually never been UK colonies. Rwanda, Mozambique, and Gabon, who joined last year,
And part of the Cameroons.
and part of Cameroon. So there's clearly no deep historical link, and arguably there is quite a strong historic link to countries that have been part of the same club for the last 50 years. So that seems like a very odd construction. I think Lara also mentioned earlier that, of course, Scotland and Wales have extended voting rights based on residence in the election they have control over. So they have moved that step, and so it's ultimately, it's also not entirely accurate to say it's it's the UK. It's actually England ultimately that has taken that view.
Okay.
Any other questions actually to Lara? Denisa, did you want to conclude? So any other questions on that, or should we move to Luljeta? From either of you.
Carry on. I've
carry on.
gone a few minutes.
Okay, fantastic. So
Can you take a question from Jane then, if so Peter, sorry, needs to go. Did you want to take a question from? Or do you want to hold on with that?
Should we hold on with that and
Okay.
just have the speakers in the room first? So so the next speaker is Luljeta Nuzi, who is CEO of Shpresa.
You must turn the camera around.
Shpresa.
Thank you. I think that's
Albanian, and she'll talk specifically about the challenges facing Albanian-speaking community registering and voting in the local election. So, floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting, us here from Shpresa. Albanian community is a relatively new community here in the UK. On the last census, there are just under the question, if the resident has been born in Albania, we have this answers that age 15 is 2,962, age 16 to 24, 8,000 over 8,000, age 25 to 34 over 27,000, and age 65 plus over 1,000. And if we want to understand where they are based, mainly, they'll be in London, over 34,000 people, Southeast, over 8,000, and Wales, it will be over 700. Shpresa works with the Albanian speaking community and has worked for over 20 years to enable the integration with dignity. And one of the things that we've done over the years is helping people that live here in UK to vote or to be part of registration, knowing that the power comes through vote, knowing that responsibilities as citizens is manifested through vote. However, when you work with the Albanian speaking community, mainly people have come from Albania, Kosovo, or from Italy and Greece as a second time, or Bulgaria as a second time citizens, not necessarily strong ties with voting, not necessarily understanding the power of vote, and having quite a lot of difficulties in settling here, lack of language, loneliness, and a large number of them come here as asylum seekers, refugees. And on the past 10 years, we've seen people as second-time citizens. So when you go to want to vote, or if you are encouraged, the systems is complicated, they don't understand. So we have, over the years, created ways where, you know, our building has become the house where everyone is helped practically. We have got councillors or, you know, MPs such as Stephen Timms coming and talking to our residents in terms of how they can vote, why they can vote, and encouraging that. I think on the last census, we really took, you know, an action, and we had the census translated in Albanian language. It's not, you know, it's a small community, you know, in terms of numbers, but everyone matters. And that is what we believe, that everyone matters and everyone should exercise the voting and the power that they have. So as you know, the illegal migration bill and the language used on the past year has been vilifying the Albanian community. And that has destroyed, you know, our power in terms of going and asking people to vote, because the language that is used, you know, towards, you know, aligning the Albanian community with organized crime or with the boats really, really has an impact. And we have seen an increase of bullying, racism, discrimination amongst the Albanian community. So what tools we as institution, or we as people that we want to encourage people to be part of the democracy can use when we see such a thing? So we're not giving up. We're saying that you have a power. We, you know, working and bringing on, you know, our MPs and councillors. But I think every politician should be mindful of the language that is used, because that has a really, really ripple effect on people that live here and are British and contributing to our economy. And they are people that work and are part of our society. So that is what I've got to say. Thank you.
Tell me what the position is for Hong Kongers and Ukrainians.
On voting rights? For Hong Kongers, they can vote as the ones that have BNO passports as Commonwealth. For Ukrainians, they do not have the right to vote. And Hong Kongers with Chinese passport cannot vote.
Right, so but the BNO,
But, you know,
that's because of the BNO status.
For those who arrived lately, page 10 has the list of 4 countries who made agreements on mutual voting rights at local levels.
Until now, it may change.
Yeah, no, that's right.
We'll give it a go.
Well, thank you very much.
Managed to, given the number of French citizens.
My assumption is that some of these the countries that are not here, such as France, require like constitutional changes to sign a bilateral voting rights agreement.
Germany is certainly, I mean, Germany there was a big case when the US put in place required voting right in 92, and then actually the Federal Constitutional Court said that it was not constitutional, but they had to amend the constitution to allow for that. So there are European countries that are unlikely to do that, but it does create, so these the 4 countries plus Malta and Cyprus that are in the Commonwealth, plus Ireland. So they're actually, of the 27 countries, nationals of 7 countries can vote, but the other 20 can't. And I think that demonstrates actually how kind of inconsistent, in some ways irrational this is. I mean, they can live and work in the exact same places, and the wider international points. So,
and the point of the hostile narrative does really affect our work on the ground, because people may say, "Oh, I don't want to register because I don't want to be judged, or I don't want to I'm just a guest here." Like that narrative does end up happening on the ground as well, where people are just internalizing that idea of like, "Oh, this is not my home," even though they've lived here forever.
Well, I don't think they're quite internalizing it, because we have the same issue with people from the Caribbean who've been here since the 60s, because a lot of them are not coming forward to for that compensation. For that very reason, because the government hasn't stopped the deportation. So people are nervous coming forward.
Right.
Because they think, okay, if I come forward, I may be, sent to a asylum center and then
So I don't want to
deported.
register.
They don't want to register, and
Mm.
you have to admit that the government really sends that message. Yes.
Yeah.
So there's a campaign I know in the Caribbean community to try to get the government to stop that message about deportation.
Right.
Very tough in election year.
Yeah.
But I also remember one in Cambridge for local elections, there would very often be Italians who would say, well, I'm not voting. I said, but you've got the right to vote. Yeah, but it's not really my home. So there was that sense of people saying, well, I'm not sure I'm going to use the rights that I've got.
Yes, it happens quite often, and we try to tackle that by what Denisa was saying, like regular involvement. And one thing that we are doing in my organization is we're now training first generation migrants to stand as political candidates, because who better place to engage their own community than themselves? I'm from Brazil, and as far as I know, I'm the first Brazilian councillor, and I had people from everywhere coming to me like, oh, can you do this, can you do that? Like, I can only do in my local authority. But people, the representation does matter. It's not the solution, the final solution, but it matters. People get engaged. So I think small actions like that it eventually get more people engaged and believing that politics is for them as well.
And I think it takes quite it's an inner job, I think, for each community to, educate and to train people within our community to understand the power of voting. So we, in our services, for example, we have voting in the classroom, voting in a bigger, and we do lots of listening. And, for the campaigns to be chosen, they have to vote. And we just try to reflect that they can be used to the voting and to the power of voting. So that's why I think, it's crucial for us to continue to do this work. It's not something like, it will happen over the night to build a trust. Trust is something that takes time, and it takes, the politician to come to the trusted spaces of the community and not just, knock on the door when the voting takes place, but knock all the 4 years before the voting. So they are well known and people have been helped on personal level.
I think it will be interesting to see, given Scotland and Wales an inclusive franchise, to see whether that has an effect, A, on participation, B, on the number of people standing for candidates. Because I think I'm right, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that essentially the same eligibility rules apply for standing as they do for voting. So anyone who has a right to vote, it's not the case in every country, by the way, but here the two are identical, which means anyone from any country essentially could stand in Scotland for anywhere else, not just for local elections, right? Also for Parliament, right? For the Scottish Parliament and Welsh Assembly. So that's significant. And if that leads to more people, then that may have that trickle effect. So I think perhaps for us as organizations, it's worthwhile monitoring this and seeing whether it has had that kind of discernible effect.
Yeah, because when you go to Scotland, when you speak to people, they do feel that welcome. So maybe I'd be very interested to see if they do get more involved.
Yeah, because I mean,
I think it makes total sense as well, if I may say so. What you're saying, that some people are not used to maybe the same kind of democracy or voting, that everyone can vote, in local election once they're here, get involved, and then you can, after a while, then go to the next level with national elections. Based on
This year, we are thinking to have a manifesto. I think we want to have a collectively, response and have a manifesto, and then, keep people signing up to it, and then keep them accountable. We want to try. We haven't tried this before, so we'll see how that happens.
It's a great idea. Absolutely. We as an organization also support this. I think again, the UK, so it goes back to the point about, countries like Germany or France. So countries that have very have been very clear that they only allow their citizens to vote in general election, it would obviously be difficult to change that. But ironically, because the UK has actually been quite flexible, because basically countries of 53 countries, citizens of 53 countries can vote here as long as they're here physically. Right? That's potentially very large numbers of people. Then it does make it, it makes the case for saying it should only be citizens, obviously false, because that's not the case. But also I think it makes it easier for people to, if you, I think the general, I mean, Lara, I think you guys have done some polling of this. You tell people, for people who have been here long enough to have got settled status or definitely to remain, should they be allowed to vote? I think actually the majority.
Yeah, over 60% of people that we've polled have agreed that every settled resident should have the right to vote, but also 54% have agreed that every resident should vote. Yeah. So yeah, there's this perception generally, like what we hear in the media, that everyone is very anti-migrant, and that the reality is not necessarily that.
Yeah.
I think that's important actually to highlight that. Actually.
Yes.
The public would support that campaign actually, if it were put by some of the political parties, of course.
Yeah, and fortunately we have had support from the main opposition party. So during the elections bill, Liberal Democrats, Greens and Labour have all in one way or another tabled an amendment to the bill proposing to extend the right to vote. So I guess I just have to hope that there is something.
Included in the manifesto.
Quite, yeah. Well, it's a question of whether you will make it, I mean, related to your point on the manifesto, whether you will make it to a manifesto, and if not, whether civil society can try and pressure for this to happen post-election.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it might be hard to get support, or it might be a hard media sale if it was like as soon as you arrive, but if it's after 5 years, which just happens to be the number of years when you can, after which you can get settled status, then I think that is I think most people would.
There's a complication with the UK is that there is no there's no legal term for residence in the way that other countries have, of like having a residence card or an identity card.
Yeah.
So the only way they legally can be done is through lawful residence in terms of immigration status, which is limited leave to remain or indefinite leave to remain. But unfortunately, the conversation has been toxic in one way or another when it comes to using the terms illegal or economic migrants and all of that. But when you just get to the details of it, there is a way for
exactly the way they've even managed to construct it in a way that includes asylum seekers. So once they are in the system, once you've applied for asylum, you need to be legally a resident, and so for that purpose you can vote. I don't know what will happen now, in fact, with the Illegal Migration Act. What will be the status of people once the regulations are in place, and whether they'd be able to do it. But in Scotland, certainly they managed to define lawful residence for this purpose. That's great. Should we open it up also to see if there are any questions from online?
Can I just say that?
Absolutely, and I'll
well, yeah, it's such a great discussion. I don't want to sort of say too much. I just thought those were fantastic presentations. Thank you very much indeed. And I also think that it will resonate with the public, because there's a fundamental unfairness here, which you are articulating with clarity and passion. You just have to keep going. And I think even if the opposition parties don't put it in the manifesto, the fact that they've tabled those amendments in the debate and so on, it's on the record, is very, very important. And you want to hope that's their position. Okay, and we go back to that, we keep pushing for that. And they may just not want to give a hostage to fortune before the election, where there are other calculations. But what is good is you've got that on the record, so you can always go back to that. No, I just wanted to say, if I may, that I mean, and hello, Brenda, great to have you with us. Really great to have you with us. Welcome, Julie. Thank you so much for your support. There's also the European elections in June, and that's even more complicated, because some EU member states allow their members, their citizens to vote from other EU member states, but not from outside the EU, etc., etc. So, there are other ramifications of the European vote, even in parts of the UK where it's even more complicated, which I think we may hear something about in a moment. But yeah, so how do you see, you know, how are you approaching that? Because I'm sure you're going to want to be sort of getting people that I suspect you're going to be wanting to mobilise votes for European elections. as well.
Yeah.
How does that fit together? You've got the local elections in May,
Yeah.
European elections in June.
Well, we've been doing some work with the EU Parliament here in the UK. We were at the conference that happened in December last year. So where possible, like in some of the events, we're just reminding people as well of the fact that, oh, and there's other elections that are coming up. So it's just, but because as you said, with the EU Parliament elections, it does depend even more on your nationality. So the EU Parliament has put together very accessible briefing paper on that just includes like your nationality, how you can register, and whether you can vote from abroad or not. So we're just sharing those resources. But again, like you have to be in person in the communities informing people, because of course social media can go only so far, but as you said, like that trust and being present and explaining something that can be seen as complicated when you're down with someone that understands with the resources, people can then carry that information home with them.
Great. Should
you want to add anything?
Well, I mean, I think just to add on that point, I mean, there are 4 countries which effectively don't allow citizens of their countries to vote in European election unless they live somewhere in the EU, right? So that's Ireland, Malta, Cyprus, and Denmark, right? And that is particularly problematic in the UK, right? Because you've got the UK. I mean, it's problematic, arguably, generally, wherever you are in the world, because you are an EU citizen in the same way you should retain your right to vote for a national election. You should retain your right to vote in European elections. But it's particularly problematic in Britain because those people haven't left the EU, like in a way Britain has caused them to leave these. They moved here as people who moved to an EU country, right? And they didn't get a right to vote in the referendum in most of those cases, and still now are losing out. So, and I think it's particularly problematic in Northern Ireland. I think that's, from what I gather, is something that Jane wanted to voice. So we've got Jane Morris online, and I think Jane will want to direct her question.
Jane?
Yes, thank you very much. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes, good. Okay, well, I've got a couple of lines, quick. I want to know, could you possibly outline what is being done to accommodate the European rights of those citizens of Northern Ireland, and I'm talking about British, Irish, or both, to vote in and or stand for the European elections in June? It's important to note here that there are around 500,000 people in Northern Ireland with Irish citizenship, including British and Irish, many of whom will obviously younger, not of the age, but many of whom will want to exercise their European rights. So can we establish what's being done about it? Thank you.
Unfortunately, on my side, nothing. At the moment, as an organization, we don't have a presence there. So, I mean, I would be happy if you sent me more information about that, like the details, and we do have some connections with some other organizations that are more present there. So I'll be happy to just try to connect with the right people, but me directly, I haven't done anything, sorry.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the in a way the addressee really is the Irish state, right? Because because it is a national matter for each country in the EU to enfranchise their citizens. But I think Jane, you'll hopefully agree with me. I think the particular complication in Northern Ireland is not only are there so many people in Northern Ireland who are actually European citizens, but they are basically European citizens in an area that is outside the EU, but is governed to a large extent by EU law because of the Brexit agreement. And that's different than if they were living in Bali or they were living in Canada, right? And so, yeah, there's a question also, I think, for parliamentarians and others, whether there are any levers that can be put to influence the Irish government to even if they don't make a general exception, because there's a bigger debate, I think, in Ireland as to whether Irish citizens who live outside Ireland can vote, because there's so many, frankly, because of Irish nationality laws. But whether there should be a specific exception for Northern Ireland, given its circumstance, I think that's an important thing to consider.
I wasn't really wanting necessarily an answer. I was wanting to just to put the question in terms of increasing awareness about 500,000 people, European citizens disenfranchised. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah,
That's it.
Well, yeah, I certainly get the message. I think we all have in the room, Jane. You certainly have got your message across, and that gives me the opportunity to try and get my message across, which is that, you know, just remind us that Europe is a union of nations and states, it's a union of markets and money, but it's also a union of citizens.
Yes.
And if the European Union, it loves to talk about itself as a European citizen, so what about European citizens in Northern Ireland or in Belfast? And, you know, Rufus mentioned Bali. It does seem a bit odd to me that if you're a French citizen living, you know, in Bali, as far as I know, you can vote in the European parliamentary elections, but if you're an Irish citizen living in Belfast, you can't. And of course, the point about as well that for me about Northern Ireland is, and I don't want to rock the boat here because I know this is a very, very, very difficult, tricky historic issue, and you were very much involved at the time of the Good Friday Agreement. I was a newly elected MP, so we always will remember where we've been and where we need to stay. But nevertheless, you know, there is something called Europe and the European Union, and of course Northern Ireland is part of the single market.
Exactly.
So if it's part of the single market, shouldn't it also have representatives in the European Parliament?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, other considerations aside, of course, but and that's my. I think you were asking a slightly rhetorical question, and that's my. I'm responding to your question, if I may, Jane, with my rhetorical question, and certainly both of those will be in the report of this meeting. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity as well. Very much appreciated.
You were just saying that, I mean, the other countries in.
Yeah, because there are EEA countries that are part of the single market but don't have a vote.
But their citizens are not individually, I think that's Roger's point in a way, are not individually EU citizens, right? So the application of Northern Ireland, you've got effectively 500,000 people living in the single market as EU citizens, but don't have a right to vote.
And similarly in UK, people in Norway cannot vote in local elections here
Exactly. Yeah.
as EEA.
Yeah.
You couldn't previously.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, well, no, yeah, that's a great point from Julie. But of course, the thing about the reason that Northern Ireland is part of the single market is because, for the purposes of the single market, the island of Ireland is being treated as one territorial unit. So if you're treating it as one territorial unit for the purposes of the single market, perhaps you should also treat it as one territorial unit simply for the purposes of the European parliamentary election, which would actually invite us to have British citizens who don't have Irish passports being able to vote in the European parliamentary elections if they're residents of Northern Ireland as well. But I think that's I mean, I think I don't know where this is going, but I
think that's a very, very, very good point, because British Irish are both, according to the Good Friday Agreement, there couldn't be discrimination, and only the Irish Europeans could apply or could vote, because British, you know, both British or Irish, or both, should be able to exercise their European rights, whether or not they hold an Irish passport. That's a very delicate, difficult, and sensitive issue. But on the representation one, it is true as well. That is an argument of many people who are anti-protocol, etc., are saying, you know, why should we do this without representation? So it is certainly an answer for them, is to get the representation, stand in the European elections.
Yeah. So So I think it's an interesting question. I mean, I think if you're an Irish citizen from Northern Ireland, I imagine you can relocate to the south and stand in a seat in the Republic. But then, of course, it's something that only would attract certain people in Northern Ireland and not other people in Northern Ireland. And it also doesn't answer the point about representation. of the people in Northern Ireland, right? And that's
Definitely.
which I think is the key.
Yes. Just to bring back to the earlier presentation again, because I think, as you say, Ruby, it is really about representation, isn't it? And you were talking about that sense of belonging to the community, being fully part. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that in terms of the experience of people that you're speaking to. Because I think this issue of representation, I mean, if we start talking about the specifics of this country can't, that's a deep unfairness, but we're going to lose people who don't know very much about it. But if you talk about representation as part of being part of a community, I think that's something that people very much relate to, isn't it? Is that what you're finding?
Yeah, would you like to go?
Well, I think, for us as a newly community and not necessarily being able to stand for election or understand or feel that they are powerful enough in terms of to be elected, it's still new. And I think we, through our leadership program at all levels, we're trying to, make everyone understand the power of vote and then help people to understand how they can get into the political life, through the volunteering, through going and accessing different parties. I think for us as an institution is non-partisan, just exercise your vote has the power, exercise that, and you can be, one of those people that make decision. But unless you bring the councillors and the politician to their welcome spaces and safer spaces, it's not going to happen. So that's why we have, built as an institution very strong connection with, MPs, especially Stephen Timms, who comes at our messy groups, at our mother toddler groups, at our youth programs. We get the council, local councillors to come, and we've got in Barking and Dagenham even a flag raise that recognise the importance of the Albanian community in Barking and Dagenham, as well as the Kosovan population, Albanian from Kosovo, in Barking and Dagenham. But this doesn't happen overnight. We've been doing that for 20 years, and we feel like this is going somewhere. There is more interest of people in our community to be part of political life.
Yeah, I think we've seen similar instances of, especially like I'm from Brazil, so the Brazilian community is also mainly first generation migrants in the UK who have not gone to school in the UK, so they might not necessarily know all of the information and the details about the UK political system. So there's the direct representation that we're trying to achieve of having more first generation migrants in local authorities, in parliament, so that they can motivate their own communities. And policymaking is informed by your own experiences. So that, of course, will help us create better policies for our own communities. But then there's the indirect representation that a lot of people are still not used to mobilizing for themselves. So one example that I've really touched me, that this Brazilian woman, and I was like, oh, okay, you don't have the right to vote, had just shared that unfortunate news with her that she could not register to vote. But I said, but you can still participate, you can still write to your councillors, you can still write to your MP, like you're still a resident, you're still a constituent. So she did, she wrote to her councillors about the fact that she thought that her road was really dangerous. And they said to her that they could put a zebra crossing there. And I know that for many of us, like, oh, zebra crossing, but for her it was really important. And it showed her that, oh, actually, I can write to my councillors and they can do something. Might not be the most revolutionary, radical thing, but it changed her daily life. And it just planted that seed of, oh, I can write to my representatives and they're going to represent me. And it just encourage her to stay working with our organization, volunteering with us, and dedicated to go out and inform others about their democratic rights. And I think in local authorities, there's so much that goes unnoticed by residents. Like there are consultations, there are surgeries that a lot of people just think that at the local level there might not be that much that can be done for them, but it's our job to show them that actually there are a lot of things that are going to be influencing you one way or another. And it might not be direct immigration, but all of us will be affected by housing, the local parks, transport in one way or another.
Coming.
Oh, I'm sorry. We'll just finish in a few minutes. Yeah, and I think actually the interesting point is that, I mean, not all countries, I mean, not all systems, is it the case that people were not formally constituents in a
Yeah.
legal sense can participate. So the fact that that is the case in the UK actually is also an opening, because my sense is that might be a kind of an indirect way of thinking about it. But if a lot of people who are not able to vote at the moment write to their MPs, etc., and say, I have these concerns, but I unfortunately I can write to you as my MP, but I can't vote in these elections, and that will also bring this to an awareness, because I get the sense that because the system's so confusing, because so many countries can vote and whereas the citizens of others can't, even MPs may not necessarily know, right? It's
We've done this, we've done regular tours of parliament for migrants who do not have the right to vote to come in and say, well, but this is still my democratic house.
absolutely.
Even though I don't have the right to vote, I can still come here. I can still talk to my member of parliament and express my concerns. And for all of the faults in the system, this is something that we have to recognize as a positive, that most often your MP or councillor will respond to you. They might not be able to do exactly what you need them to do or you want them to do, but you're more likely to get a response. And that's something that that's something that is within our power, and we have to make use of.
Exactly. So that anyone who's a resident can contact their MP. And they say it's not arguably the MP. It's not a relevant question for, unless it's a relevant immigration question. It's not a relevant question for the MP whether somebody is or isn't a citizen of this country, and that's important, because I think a lot of migrants don't realize they have that power. I think Lydia had a question, and Roger will come to you. So Lydia, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah. Hi everyone. Really interesting conversation. Just thinking about what Luli and Lara have just been saying. A colleague of mine tried to engage with the local MP to talk about EU citizens living in the UK post-Brexit and engaging with them. And the MP said, oh, if it's around Brexit and EU citizens, just leave that to government. So I would just like to kind of highlight the fact that it's also very important for those in political leadership to actually understand that whatever someone's immigration status, like Ruvi has just said, they are also residents, and they also have issues and concerns that need to be raised with their local councillors and MPs. And if we internalize that, the kind of Brexit rhetoric about people not being welcome here, then it means we're kind of doubly disenfranchising people from political representation, but also participation. And I think what's interesting is how much we've talked about the work being done to inform EU citizens of their rights, but we also need to inform those within the institutions of people's rights and entitlements. And the onus shouldn't just be on EU citizens to be able to engage, but also those in the institutions. I just wanted to kind of flag that.
Can I also add, I mean, that is
Border force as well, because I think there was a couple of instances, I think a French citizen and a Spanish citizen who've lived here for a number of years, they work, etc., went home for Christmas, and on the way back.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, happened to you as well.
Happened to you.
Yeah. So, and I think the French citizen actually lost their job. And the only reason it was reversed is because it got into the media. Yes, which shouldn't be the case, So I agree with you that some sort of training or awareness is needed, not just with our politicians, but with people at the border force, etc.
It is very true, and I don't exchange any politician in any way, but we've seen it today as well, that there is like a full clarity of the changes of the Elections Act. I've had conversations with politicians where they've said, oh, but now every EU citizen can vote in general elections. And I'm like, oh, where is this information coming from? So but change has been happening so fast. There's so many bills going through in such a speed that it's difficult for anyone, and like you have a lot to do. So yeah, there is definitely this task of informing those in power of what they're actually voting for and what's actually been implemented
And it's also taking it in I think, in a systematic and serious way, right? So again, not to sing the praise of the country subject now to serious wind in the north, but it really has done a
Yeah.
reform of its electoral laws with a view to kind of seeing its electoral laws as coherent. So it's also taken a much more nuanced view around prisoner voting than the view that's been taking south of the border. And I mean, I think it is a model to, and 16-year-olds.
yeah.
So I think it is a model actually to learn from, of making your democracy much more inclusive. And certainly New Europeans, I think that is our position, that we want the place to become more inclusive. And that's one of the ways for that to happen is through expanding the franchise, certainly not contracting it. In addition to all the logistical things that you were talking about, it's really the wrong message to say, let's take away the right to vote from people who already have it.
Yeah.
Right? Roger.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's how democracy works. If you're in favour of democracy, then you need to be in favour of as inclusive democracy as possible. And all the same arguments apply. And I think it is radical to get a set of so because imagine being in a situation where that doesn't happen, and where we remember recently the Grenfell disaster, and we know that the community there were pointing to these things, and it wasn't listened to. And the same thing with the Morandi Bridge in Italy, and many other things you can point to. And this point about officials not knowing, the computer saying no when the answer is yes, and there's nothing you can do about it. That's why we said there should be a very simple green card that people just say, because they don't get across they're humans like we are, and they make mistakes. The trouble is, when they make a mistake, that's your life at stake, and you don't have a voice. I wanted just though to ask, so important, the crossing, you have voice and representation. It's also very important, you would start touching on it now, that we from different communities are themselves elected representatives. And I wonder I thought you might have something as well to say about that in terms of how do we, it's not just a question of making sure that everybody votes. You're talking about the challenges of some people being community not voting because of the reasons you said earlier. It's also important they stand as candidates, isn't it? And the same applies, I think, for EU citizens. And we see more. And that's kind of really important too, isn't it? I wondered how does that work? How do we get to a situation where we have more
Well, I think
representation?
you need outreach programs, and as has been said earlier, it's about trust. So if you have someone from your community encouraging you to vote or encouraging you to put yourself forward, that goes a very long way to get people involved, one in voting and one considering, to go for local councillors. And I think there's quite a lot of that happening. But I want to say as well that with the main parties, they also need to be inclusive, because I know of cases where people put themselves forward, and there's like a pecking order, the long-standing trade unionists who's being so I mean, there is work to be done. It's not just about encouraging people, but it's also making sure that the parties themselves are inclusive and encouraging people to come forward.
Very important point. Kate, did you want to say?
You're saying about that outreach is a really good initiative, Elect Her UK, and actually they've got a webinar tomorrow, Be a Councillor workshop. It's non-partisan across all parties, and they're very much about better representation across all communities. Highly recommend them.
I've been to Elect Her.
That's really good. Yes, in that case.
But there are others out
Yes,
there
there
that
are
are
others as well, but I do know they're very, very good.
Yeah, because the other thing is actually getting young people elected as well.
Yeah.
Who stands for local government? Well, actually, the demographic is often quite elderly.
Well, in Oxford, actually, it is. It's kind of a mix and match.
Yeah.
You don't have the squeezed middle.
It depends a bit as well. Yeah, the different communities. And,
Right.
when you go
University
back to that point about inclusivity, when do you have your meetings? When do you encourage
Exactly.
people?
Yeah.
So if you have a meeting in the middle of a morning, that might well exclude all sorts
Exactly.
of people that you might want to be encouraging to come.
Yeah.
That's
true.
Yeah, I think we could probably go on for much longer, which is great. Great news in some ways, because I think we've uncovered a lot of topics. So I do want to thank again our speakers,
Here, here. Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
Along with the two supporters, Jane, Michaela, Lydia and Tamara for joining us online. Perhaps Julie Smith for joining us here, and indeed the rest of my colleagues, Brenda, the rest of my colleagues from Europeans, Roger and Elsa. And yeah, I think it's to be continued really in terms of campaigning around all of these issues to raise awareness. I think well beyond this room, and we'll also be looking. I think we just to kind of top that. Or to finish this off, one of New Europeans' campaign, or Europeans UK jointly with Unlock Democracy, and relates to Jane's question, is about making sure that now that the Election Act has made all British citizens living abroad have a right to vote in general election, irrespective of how long they've lived there, to make that voice heard in a intelligent and representative way through overseas constituencies, and we'll continue our campaign around that as well. We have an early day motion now in Parliament that was put by Christine Jardine, MP, and has now already had quite a number of signatories. So I just wanted to kind of end with that, because that's a part of the to be continued from our perspective. So unless anyone else wanted to comment, thank everyone for coming this evening, and best of luck with all of our campaigns.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for
Bye.
joining. Thank you.